My best friends slept with my wife on my wedding night, so I destroyed both their lives 20 years later. I still remember the exact moment everything changed, though it took me 2 decades to fully understand what had happened that night. The wedding had been perfect, everything we'd dreamed of for 3 years of planning. The venue was this beautiful old mansion with gardens that looked like something out of a fairy tale, and everyone kept telling us how happy we looked together. She wore her grandmother's dress, altered to fit perfectly, and I couldn't stop smiling every time I looked at her walking down that aisle toward me. The reception went late, probably until 2 in the morning, with all our friends and family dancing and celebrating. I remember thinking this was the happiest day of my life, watching her laugh with her bridesmaids and seeing my parents finally warm up to her after being skeptical for so long. My best friend since childhood had given the most amazing speech about friendship and love, making everyone cry happy tears, and I felt so grateful to have him standing beside me as my best man. We'd rented the bridal suite at this fancy hotel downtown, one of those places with marble everything and champagne waiting on ice. The plan was simple: head up together after saying goodbye to everyone, start our married life properly. But she said she felt sick suddenly, something about the salmon at dinner not sitting right, and asked if she could go up first to lie down for a bit. I was disappointed but understanding. You know how it is when someone you love isn't feeling well. I stayed downstairs for another hour, helping my parents gather up the centerpieces and leftover cake, making sure the photographers got their final shots. My best friend was still there too, helping clean up like the good guy I'd always known him to be. When I finally made it up to the suite around 3:30, I used my key card and walked into what should have been the perfect start to our marriage. Instead, I found them together in our bed, still partially clothed but clearly having been intimate. The champagne bottle was empty on the nightstand, and her wedding dress was crumpled on the floor next to his tuxedo jacket. They both froze when they saw me, and for a moment nobody said anything. The silence felt like it lasted forever, but it was probably only a few seconds before they started scrambling to cover themselves and explain. She was crying and saying it wasn't what it looked like, that they'd just been talking and things got out of hand. He was apologizing over and over, saying he was drunk and stupid and it would never happen again. I couldn't process what I was seeing at first. Like my brain refused to accept that the two people I trusted most in the world had done this to me on my wedding night. I just stood there staring at them, feeling this strange numbness spreading through my whole body. Then the anger hit me like a freight train, and I started yelling things I can't even remember now. The next few hours were a blur of shouting and tears and desperate explanations. She swore it was a mistake, that she'd been drinking too much and felt confused and emotional. He kept saying he'd been in love with her for years, but never said anything because he respected our relationship. They both begged me not to throw away our friendship and marriage over one terrible moment of weakness. I ended up leaving the hotel that night and driving to my brother's house across town. I didn't sleep at all, just sat on his couch staring at the wall and trying to figure out what to do next. Part of me wanted to forgive them both, to believe it really was just a drunken mistake that would never happen again. But another part of me felt like everything I'd believed about my life had been completely shattered. The next morning, she showed up at my brother's place with puffy eyes and that same wedding dress in a garment bag. She looked so broken and sorry that I almost caved right then and there. She promised it would never happen again, that she wanted to work through this together, that our marriage was worth fighting for despite this horrible start. I made a decision that I've questioned every day since then. I decided to forgive them both and try to move forward. We went to counseling, we talked through everything, we set boundaries about her contact with him. He moved to another state a few months later, supposedly for a new job opportunity, and we barely spoke after that. For the next 20 years, I convinced myself I'd made the right choice. We built a life together, bought a house in the suburbs, had 2 kids who became the center of my world. She seemed genuinely committed to making things work, and most of the time I could forget about that night entirely. We had good years, really good years, where I felt like we'd overcome something that would have destroyed most couples. But there were always these little moments that brought it all back. When she'd get a text and quickly put her phone away, or when she'd be late coming home from work without a good explanation. I'd find myself checking her email or phone sometimes, hating myself for not being able to fully trust her, but unable to stop myself from looking for signs of another betrayal. Our kids grew up thinking they had parents who loved each other completely, and maybe that was true in some ways. I did love her, or at least I loved the life we'd built together. But there was always this underlying tension, this sense that I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I never felt fully secure in our relationship, even during the happiest times. Then last year, everything changed again in the most unexpected way. I was cleaning out my late father's attic, going through boxes of old photos and documents he'd kept for decades. In one box, I found a stack of letters tied with a ribbon, and I recognized my best friend's handwriting immediately. They were love letters, dozens of them, written to my wife over the course of several years. The letters were dated, and I realized with growing horror that their affair hadn't been a one-time wedding night mistake. It had been going on for months before our wedding, and according to these letters, it continued for at least 2 years after we got married. The letters were full of details about their meetings, their plans to be together, their discussions about whether she should leave me. Reading those letters felt like being punched in the stomach over and over again. They talked about how guilty they felt lying to me, but how they couldn't stay away from each other. They made plans to meet at hotels when he was in town for business, coordinated their stories to make sure I wouldn't get suspicious. They even discussed what they'd do if I ever found out. The worst part was reading about how they'd laughed about my obliviousness, how easy it was to fool me because I trusted them so completely. She'd told him about our private conversations, our intimacy, our problems, treating our marriage like some kind of joke they shared between them. He'd written about how he'd never felt guilty about being my best man because he'd been with her the night before too. I sat in that dusty attic for hours, reading every single letter and trying to process the magnitude of their deception. 20 years of my life had been built on a lie, and I'd been too naive or too desperate to see it. The woman I'd forgiven and rebuilt my life with had been playing me for a fool from the very beginning. The letters also revealed something else that completely changed my understanding of everything. My youngest child, the daughter I'd raised and loved for 18 years, wasn't biologically mine. There were references to this in several letters, discussions about whether to tell me, decisions about how to handle the situation. She'd known all along and had let me believe the child was mine. That night, I confronted her with the letters. I'd never seen her look so terrified, like she was seeing a ghost. She tried to deny it at first, saying the letters were old and didn't mean anything, that whatever had happened was in the past. But when I read specific passages out loud, she finally broke down and admitted everything. She confirmed that their affair had lasted for years, that she'd been torn between us but couldn't give up either relationship. She said she'd ended it when he moved away, that she'd spent the last 18 years trying to be the wife I deserved. She also admitted that our youngest daughter was his child, something she'd suspected but never confirmed with a test. The betrayal felt even worse than it had 20 years ago, because now I understood the full scope of what they'd done to me. I'd wasted 2 decades of my life trying to rebuild trust with someone who'd never deserved it in the first place. I'd raised another man's child as my own, not through choice but through deception. I filed for divorce the next week, and that's when I started planning my revenge. I'd spent 20 years being the bigger person, being forgiving and understanding, and where had it got me? They'd both moved on with their lives, while I'd been living in a fantasy built on their lies. First, I hired a private investigator to find out everything I could about both of their current situations. She'd built a successful career in marketing, had a great reputation in our community, and was proud of the life she'd created. He'd done well for himself too, married with 3 kids, running his own consulting business in Portland. I started with her professional life because I knew that's where it would hurt the most. I had copies of all those letters, and some of them were written on company letterhead from her old job. I sent anonymous packages to her current employers, her professional associations, and several of her biggest clients. The letters showed a pattern of deception and dishonesty that didn't exactly scream trustworthy business partner. Within a month, she'd lost 2 major clients and was facing a professional ethics investigation. Her reputation in the industry was completely shot, and she had to resign from her position rather than face termination. 20 years of building her career, gone because people couldn't trust someone who'd been so systematically dishonest in her personal life. For him, I took a different approach. I found out he'd been having some financial difficulties lately, had taken out several loans to keep his business afloat. I also discovered that his wife had no idea about any of his past with my ex-wife, believed he'd been faithful throughout their entire relationship. I sent his wife copies of the letters, along with a detailed timeline of the affair and evidence of his ongoing deception. I also sent copies to his business partners, his church community, and several of his professional contacts. The letters painted a picture of a man who was willing to betray his closest friend and lie systematically for years. His marriage imploded within 2 weeks. His wife filed for divorce and started telling everyone in their social circle about what he'd done. His business partners decided they couldn't work with someone they couldn't trust, and he lost several major contracts. He had to sell his house and move into a small apartment, and his own kids barely speak to him now. But I wasn't done yet. I realized that our youngest daughter deserved to know the truth about her parentage, even though it would hurt her. I arranged for a private DNA test and confirmed what the letters had suggested. Then I sat down with her and explained everything, showed her the evidence, and told her she had the right to know who her biological father was. She was devastated, of course, but also angry at her mother for lying to her for 18 years. She decided she wanted to meet her biological father, despite everything that had happened. When she contacted him, it created even more chaos in his already destroyed life, because his ex-wife and kids found out he had another child he'd never told them about. The most unexpected twist came when I discovered that my ex-wife had been having another affair, this one with her boss at the marketing firm. The private investigator had found evidence of this relationship, and I realized she'd been unfaithful throughout our entire marriage, not just in the early years. The pattern of deception had never actually stopped. I sent this information to her ex-boss's wife, along with documentation of how the affair had affected business decisions at the company. It turned out they'd been embezzling money together to fund their relationship, taking from client accounts and covering it up with false reports. This led to criminal charges against both of them. Watching their lives fall apart felt satisfying in a way I hadn't expected. For 20 years, I'd carried the weight of their betrayal, wondering if I'd been too forgiving or too naive. Now they were both facing the consequences of their choices, and I felt like justice was finally being served. But the real twist came when I discovered something about my ex-best friend that changed everything again. While investigating his background, I found out that he'd been adopted as a child, and his biological father was actually my uncle, my father's brother who died when I was young. This man who'd betrayed me so completely was actually my cousin, family I'd never known about. This revelation made me question everything about our childhood friendship, about why he'd been so close to my family, about whether he'd known about our connection. I confronted him about this, and he broke down completely, admitting that he'd known about our relationship since high school but had never said anything because he was afraid of how it would change things. He explained that his adoptive parents had told him about his biological family when he turned 18, and he'd been struggling with whether to tell me ever since. He said part of why he'd been so close to my wife was because he'd felt like he was already part of our family in a way I didn't understand. This didn't excuse what he'd done, but it added another layer of complexity to the whole situation. I realized that his betrayal had been even more devastating because we'd been family without knowing it, and he'd violated that bond in the worst possible way. The final twist came when I discovered that my ex-wife had been keeping a diary throughout our entire marriage, documenting not just her affairs, but also her true feelings about me and our relationship. The private investigator had found this diary hidden in her office, and reading it was like discovering a completely different version of our life together. She'd written about how she'd never really loved me, how she'd married me because I was safe and stable but had always been bored by our relationship. She'd documented every lie she'd told me, every time she'd manipulated me into forgiving her or trusting her again. She'd written about how easy it was to fool me, how my desire to believe the best in people made me the perfect victim. The diary entries about our children were particularly heartbreaking because they showed how she'd used them as tools to keep me in the marriage. She'd written about how she'd gotten pregnant with our second child specifically to make it harder for me to leave, how she'd encouraged our kids to be closer to me so I'd be less likely to suspect her ongoing deceptions. Reading about 20 years of calculated manipulation was almost worse than discovering the original affair. I realized that our entire marriage had been a performance on her part, that she'd never been the person I thought I'd married. Every moment of happiness, every milestone we'd celebrated, every time I'd felt grateful for our relationship had been built on lies. I made the decision to share excerpts from the diary with our older child, who was now in college and old enough to understand the full scope of what had happened. I wanted them to know the truth about their mother, about the kind of person she really was underneath the facade she'd maintained for so many years. This created another wave of chaos, because our older child confronted their mother about the diary entries and demanded explanations for years of lies. The relationship between our children and their mother became strained, with both kids questioning everything they'd believed about their family and their childhood. My ex-wife tried to fight back, hired lawyers and private investigators of her own, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. The letters, the diary, the financial records, the witness statements, it all painted a picture of someone who'd been systematically dishonest for decades. She had no credible defense for any of it. The criminal charges related to the embezzlement meant she was facing potential jail time, and her professional reputation was completely destroyed. She had to declare bankruptcy and move back in with her elderly parents, losing the house and lifestyle she'd worked so hard to build. My ex-best friend's life was similarly destroyed. His business failed, his marriage was over, his relationship with his children was damaged, and he was struggling with depression and financial problems. He tried to reach out to me several times, wanting to explain or apologize, but I had no interest in hearing from him anymore. The most unexpected consequence was how this affected my relationship with my own children. Our older child understood why I'd done what I did, but struggled with the fact that their entire childhood had been built on lies. Our younger child, who'd learned she wasn't biologically mine, was angry at everyone involved and needed time to process what this meant for her identity. I realized that my revenge had been successful in destroying their lives, but it had also damaged my own family in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. My children were hurt and confused, questioning everything they'd believed about their parents and their upbringing. I'd given them the truth, but the truth had been more painful than I'd expected. Looking back now, I think I got the justice I was seeking, but at a cost I hadn't fully considered. Both of the people who'd betrayed me were facing serious consequences for their actions, and I felt vindicated in a way I hadn't experienced in 20 years. But I also realized that carrying anger and resentment for so long had changed me, made me capable of calculated cruelty I wouldn't have imagined before. The final chapter of this story is still being written, because the legal proceedings are ongoing and the effects on our extended family are still unfolding. But I can say that I no longer feel like the naive, trusting person who was so easily deceived for so many years. I've learned that sometimes the people closest to you are capable of the deepest betrayals, and that forgiveness without consequences just enables more harm. Would I do it all again knowing what I know now? Probably yes, because I think they both needed to face the consequences of their choices. But I also understand that revenge is a double-edged sword, and getting justice sometimes means accepting that everyone involved, including yourself, will be changed by the process. The most important lesson I've learned is that trust, once broken, can never be fully repaired, no matter how much time passes or how many apologies are offered. Some betrayals are too fundamental to forgive, and some people are simply not capable of the honesty and integrity that real relationships require. Today, I'm building a new life based on truth rather than lies. And while it's been painful and difficult, I finally feel like I'm living authentically for the first time in 20 years. The people who destroyed my first life are facing the consequences of their choices, and I'm free to move forward without the weight of their deception holding me back. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to let someone continue to hurt you, and sometimes that means making sure they can't hurt anyone else the same way. I think I accomplished both of those things, and while the process was brutal for everyone involved, I believe it was ultimately necessary. The story isn't over yet, but I'm finally the one writing it instead of being a character in someone else's deception. That feels like victory enough for now.